The sound is not of guns, but of a projector. A stark, grainy image trembles on the wall of a darkened London briefing room. It shows a muddy crossroads somewhere in France. Not a glorious battle scene, but its aftermath. Burned-out American trucks, their frames twisted like blackened skeletons, bodies in olive drab, covered in rain-sodden ponchos, lined up in a ditch. Captain Liam Christensen stands rigidly before the image, his face illuminated in the cold light. He is not watching the screen. He is staring at a point on the wall just above it, his jaw a tight line. The air is thick with cigar smoke and a heavier, more accusatory silence. A voice cuts through the dark, belonging to a figure hidden in the shadows of the back row. Colonel Metcalf, Army Intelligence. Crossroads, Seraphim, Captain Christensen, October 12th. A supply convoy from the 28th Infantry, carrying medical equipment and ammunition. It was intercepted by the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. A unit that, according to all our intelligence projections, should have been 120 miles to the north, containing General Patton's forces. Metcalf pauses, letting the hum of the projector fill the void. Your Operation Ferdinand, a masterpiece of radio deception. You convinced German High Command that Patton's Third Army was a dire threat in the Saar. They diverted forces to meet that threat, including the 12th SS. Christensen finally speaks, his voice quiet but clear, stripped of all emotion. A defense mechanism. The operation delayed 6 panzer divisions from reinforcing the front at Aachen. It saved an estimated 15,000 Allied lives. The assessment is in the report, sir. I've read the report, Metcalf says, his tone glacial. I am now showing you the assessment that is not in the report. The 28th Infantry was left exposed. Their flank was stripped because we were so confident the threat was elsewhere. Because of the ghost you created. These 87 men are also your operational result. A new slide clicks into place. A close-up of a dead soldier, barely older than a boy, his helmet tilted back, eyes open to the rain. Christensen flinches. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack in his armor. He had seen casualty lists, but they were numbers, columns on paper. This is a face. This is the visceral, muddy truth of his work. The ghost he conjured to save lives had also indirectly pointed a very real gun. You trade in abstractions, Captain, Metcalf continues. Signal patterns, phantom divisions, narrative constructs. This is the concrete reality. Your illusions have shadows, and those shadows have teeth. The door at the back of the room opens, slicing a blade of yellow light across the floor. Brigadier General Turner steps in, his presence immediately altering the room's chemistry. He doesn't sit. He stands beside the horrifying projection, his face lit from below. That will be all, Colonel Metcalf. The post-mortem is concluded. Metcalf gathers his papers, the sound unnaturally loud. The question remains, General. At what cost do we deploy these phantoms? At the cost the war demands, Turner replies, his eyes never leaving Christensen. Dismissed. When they are alone, Turner turns off the projector. The sudden silence is a physical relief, followed by a deeper, more profound wait. Christensen can still see the after-image of the dead boy on the back of his eyelids. He's not entirely wrong, sir, Christensen says, the professional detachment gone from his voice, replaced by a hollow fatigue. He is strategically short-sighted, Turner counters, moving to a large map of Europe. He sees a single crossroads. I see the entire board. Yes, your ghost caused a reaction. The enemy moved. War is fluid. Our next move must be so vast, so psychologically overwhelming, that their reactions will be not just mistakes, but catastrophes. He turns to Christensen, his gaze intense. I am not offering you redemption, Christensen. I am offering you a sharper sword and a heavier burden. The operation at the Saar was a parlor trick. What comes next is the main act. We are going to build an entire theater of war inside the enemy's mind. We are going to haunt them. He hands Christensen a sealed file. The word phantom is stamped across it in black block letters. Your unit exists on paper. You have full discretionary authority to recruit anyone from anywhere. Technicians, actors, linguists, forgers, the eccentrics, the misfits, the brilliant minds who don't fit in regular uniforms. You will find a place called Briarwood Manor. You will turn it into a factory for nightmares. Christensen takes the file. It feels like lead. The objective? He asks, his voice a whisper. Turner stabs a finger at the map, at the winding line of the Rhine River. When the real crossing comes, when thousands of real men climb into real boats under real fire, the German reserves must be looking the other way. Your ghosts will be their focus. You will not just mimic an army. You will create an obsession. You will make them believe in a threat so logical, so terrifyingly imminent, that they will ignore the truth even when it's shouting in their face. Your failure at Seraphim Crossroad cost 87 lives. Your failure in this will cost 50,000. The weight you feel now, Captain, is just the beginning. Do you understand? Christensen looks from the map to the blank screen where the boy's face was. This is no longer a game of signals. It is a moral calculus of staggering proportions. He sees the dead, but he also sees the thousands on the boats that might yet die. There is no clean path, only a choice of horrors. I understand, sir. The recruitment is a descent into the strange underbelly of the war effort. Christensen is a ghost himself, moving with quiet authority through bases, laboratories, and even a London theater closed due to the Blitz. He finds Eleanor Reed in a bunker at Bletchley Park, surrounded by the hum of Colossus. She is arguing with a superior about German naval codes, her voice a low, frustrated snarl. She isn't just a listener. She is a translator of rhythm, of personality. She doesn't just hear Morse, she hears the man tapping it, nervous, bored, confident. Christensen offers her not a station but a stage, the chance to become the enemy operator, to weave a personality from nothing. She accepts, her eyes gleaming with a challenge. He discovers Arthur Finch not on stage, but in a barracks, being chewed out by a red-faced sergeant for inciting malingering through dramatic monologues. Finch, with the weary eyes of a man who has seen too many USO shows fail to capture any truth, can make a crowd of bored soldiers feel something. Christensen needs that skill turned inward to make an invisible audience of German listeners believe. Finch signs on with a sardonic salute, seeing the ultimate acting challenge. Henry Choi is in a workshop, surrounded by disemboweled radios. He has modified a standard SCR-299 to do something impossible. Broadcast on two frequencies simultaneously with a delayed echo, creating the aural illusion of distance and movement. Regular command thinks his inventions are unstable, bizarre. Christensen sees genius. He offers Choi unlimited resources and a blank canvas. Choi just nods, already sketching a new schematic on a grease-stained napkin. They converge at Briarwood Manor as night falls. The manor isn't just isolated. It feels forgotten by time. The windows are blacked out, making it look like a sightless skull. Inside, the grand rooms are cavernous and cold, filled not with furniture, but with echoing space and the scent of damp stone and ozone from the waiting electronic equipment. This is not a triumphant gathering of heroes. It is an assembly of the uniquely damaged and brilliantly useful. Eleanor eyes Finch's theatrical gestures with suspicion. Finch finds Choi's silent intensity unnerving. They are tools, sharp and disparate, waiting for a hand to wield them. Christensen doesn't give them a pep talk. He stands before them in the freezing ballroom, the file on the Seraphim Crossroad in his hand. He doesn't open it. "My last operation saved 15,000 men," he says, his voice cutting through the chill. "It also left a flank exposed. 87 men in a convoy died because of it. You will be told our work saves lives. That is the theory. The reality is messier. We are not saviors. We are puppeteers in the dark. The strings we pull move real armies, cause real deaths. Sometimes those deaths are the enemy. Sometimes they are our own. That is the calculus." He lets that horrible truth hang in the air, seeing it land on each of them. This is not Bletchley, where the enemy is pure code. This is not the stage, where the curtain falls and the dead get up for a bow. Our new objective is not a single division. It is an entire army group, a monster of our own creation. We will feed it, clothe it, give it voice and character and intention. The German intelligence apparatus will be our audience. Their panic, their paranoia, will be our measure of success. You will learn to think like them, to fear what they fear, to want what they want. And then we will dangle it just out of their reach. He walks to a covered radio transmitter. "General Turner says we must haunt them, but a ghost is just a story, a memory. We must build a story so urgent, so alive, that it becomes more real than the truth. Eleanor, you will not just mimic German operators. You will be a careless American radio clerk, one whose sloppy procedures let them listen in. Finch, you will not just write dialogue. You will build the mundane, grating, boring soul of a massive military formation. Its complaints, its gossip, its petty dramas. Choi, your machines will not just broadcast. They will breathe. They will simulate the movement of columns, the establishment of headquarters, the fatigue of an advancing force." He looks at their faces, now grave, all traces of skepticism or curiosity burned away by the cold weight of the responsibility he has just placed on them. "If we do this perfectly, we will win the war 6 months sooner. If we fail, we will send thousands to die for a mistake. There is no rehearsal. The enemy is listening. They are always listening. Welcome to the Phantom Division. Your first broadcast begins at 0400. Make it boring. Make it routine. Make it utterly, devastatingly believable." As they disperse, a profound silence settles over Briarwood, deeper than before. It is the silence of a tomb or a laboratory just before a world-altering experiment. In his makeshift office, Christensen finally opens the file on Seraphim Crossroad. He doesn't look at the reports. He looks at the photograph of the young soldier. He tapes it to the edge of his desk, a silent anchor to the terrible cost of shadows. Outside, the wind moans through the barren trees, a natural sound of loneliness. Inside, Henry Choi powers up a transmitter. A low, electric hum joins the wind, the first faint pulse of a phantom heart beginning to beat in the dark. The factory is open. The ghosts are on the assembly line. Briarwood Manor did not sleep. It existed in a permanent, artificial twilight, its rhythms dictated by the rise and fall of signal strength and the fictional schedule of an army that lived only in the ether. The chill of the stone walls was now a constant companion, seeping into the bones of the inhabitants, a physical manifestation of the Cold War they waged. Captain Liam Christensen moved through the rooms like a ghost himself. The photograph of the dead soldier from Seraphim Crossroad was a lodestone on his desk, a silent judge. It was no longer about guilt, it was about fuel. It burned away any hesitation, any temptation towards cleverness over brutal, grinding credibility. The first transmissions were not dramatic. They were achingly dull. Under Eleanor Reed's precise direction, the radio room became the nervous system of the Phantom Ninth Corps. She did not just send messages. She crafted a sonic fingerprint. Her genius was in the imperfections. A slight delay in a response, mimicking the distance between a fictional headquarters and a fictional forward unit. A recurring minor error in a call sign procedure, the kind a tired, mediocre radio operator would make, not a perfect machine. She studied intercepted German traffic, learning their listening post signatures, their triangulation habits. She began to play them, sending stronger signals on tangential frequencies, creating phantom echoes on their scopes, a calculated waste of German analysts' time. Arthur Finch's domain was the soul of the beast. He had turned a small library into a scriptorium of the mundane. Walls were papered with timelines, organizational charts, and personality profiles for commanders who did not exist. He drilled his small team of actors not on grand speeches, but on the art of believable boredom. They practiced conversations about malfunctioning jeeps, about the poor quality of the coffee, about a sergeant's toothache, about rumors of leave that never came. Finch recorded these sessions, playing them back with a critical, merciless ear. Too poetic, he would snap. Too coherent. Real soldiers grunt. They repeat themselves. They swear without creativity. You are not performing Shakespeare in a trench. You are documenting the crushing weight of institutional life. One of his actors broke down, frustrated. How can they believe any of this if it's all so pointless? Finch, his own eyes hollow from lack of sleep, fixed him with a stare. Because war is 99% pointless waiting. We are giving them the gift of recognition. They will hear their own boredom echoed back at them, and in that echo, they will believe everything else. Henry Choi's workshop was the beating heart, a place of beautiful, terrifying madness. Wires snaked across floors, connecting mismatched components. He had taken Turner's mandate of movement literally. He built not one transmitter, but a network of mobile low-power units housed in the backs of unmarked trucks. These roamers were driven on carefully plotted routes around the English countryside, their signals bouncing off relay points Choi had established on hills and water towers. To a German listener, the result was not a stationary broadcast point, but a slowly migrating signal source, exactly what a traveling corps headquarters would produce. But his masterpiece was the Echo Box. It was a device of terrifying simplicity and profound deception. It could capture a short transmission, a fragment of fake traffic, and replay it hours later, miles away, at a slightly degraded strength, as if it were a real signal picked up from a great distance. It created the auditory illusion of depth, of a vast formation spread across the landscape, whispering to itself. Christensen's role was that of a conductor, and his orchestra was a creature of pure logic and applied psychology. He cross-referenced Finch's scripts with real Allied unit movements obtained from intelligence. If the real Third Army was moving north, the Phantom Ninth Corps would hint at logistical difficulties, slowing a parallel movement. The Phantom's story had to weave between the threads of reality, never contradicting what the enemy could partially verify, using truth as the scaffolding for the lie. He created a biography for the Phantom Corps commander, a meticulous, cautious man named General Jonathan Harwood. Harwood worried about fuel consumption. He filed redundant reports. He was a known entity to German intelligence, a composite of real, unremarkable generals. He was the perfect vehicle for the deception, predictable enough to be believable, cautious enough to explain why his massive force hadn't yet attacked. The pressure was a living thing in the manner. It frayed nerves. Eleanor and Finch clashed violently one night. Eleanor insisted a radio exchange was technically flawless. Finch listened and threw his notebook against the wall. "It's dead," he shouted, his voice raw. "It's perfect and it's dead. Two operators having a perfect conversation. They'd be playing cards, making jokes about the officers. There's no life. Your perfection is a siren song telling them it's a recording." Christensen intervened, not as a peacemaker, but as a surgeon. He listened to the recording. He agreed with Finch. "Eleanor, your job is not perfection. Your job is verisimilitude. Inject a mistake, a burst of static that cuts off a word, a background hum from a fictional generator. Make it sound like a war is happening around your microphone, not a sterile studio." Eleanor, her pride wounded, nodded curtly. The next transmission included a faint, synthesized sound of rain on a canvas tent roof, and the distant muffled rumble of trucks that didn't exist. It was a work of art. The first test came not from the Germans, but from their own side. A packet arrived from Allied High Command, marked Eyes Only, Phantom. It contained authenticated German intelligence summaries, captured from a shot-down courier plane. The decrypts were chilling. The Germans had noted unusual signal traffic in the sector they had chosen for the Phantom. They had designated it Funkgruppe Schatten, Radio Group Shadow. They were suspicious. They believed it might be a deception, but they could not ignore it. The volume, the consistency, the mundane depth of it was forcing them to allocate resources to investigate. A single sentence was underlined in red by a British analyst. The pattern suggests not a tactical ruse, but the birth of a new administrative headquarters. Priority of analysis, medium-high. They had done it. They had made the ghost visible. There was no celebration in Briarwood. Christensen gathered the team in the radio room, the German report in his hand. He read the key line aloud, his voice flat. Priority of analysis, medium-high. He looked up. This is not a victory. This is a declaration of war. We have their attention. Now they will start hunting. Every transmission, every pattern, will be scrutinized. Their medium-high priority must become their obsession. We must crawl inside their analysis and live there. He issued new orders, a significant escalation. They were to introduce the first element of controlled panic. Finch wrote a series of tense encrypted messages from General Harwood to a fictional superior, querying delayed arrival of bridging equipment, expressing concern about consolidation of enemy forces in Sector G7. It was a vague worry, a commander's natural caution, but it planted a seed. The Phantom was not just existing. It was planning. It had an objective. Simultaneously, on Choi's roamer trucks, operators began broadcasting the distinct short-range chatter of tank crews, fragmentary, technical, laced with profanity and jargon. This was not headquarters traffic. This was the sound of the sharp end, the sound of a spear being sharpened. The strain began to show in human terms. Choi, driven by a need to stay ahead of German detection, worked for 72 hours straight on a modification to the Echo Box, surviving on black coffee and sheer will. He collapsed before his workbench, shivering violently. Eleanor, who had developed a grudging respect for his silent genius, found him and draped a blanket over his shoulders, staying to monitor the equipment herself. Finch stopped sleeping. He wandered the halls at night, muttering dialogue, trying to find the perfect, insignificant detail that would ring true. He became the Phantom's greatest biographer, knowing its fictional soldiers better than he knew his own team. Christensen saw it all. He carried the weight of their exhaustion, the precision of their work, and the ever-present eyes of the dead soldier on his desk. He began receiving direct, encrypted queries from Turner. The general's messages were terse. Increase pressure in Sector G7. Suggest Phantom Artillery Regiment experiencing supply issues. Make them smell the weakness. The operation was no longer an experiment. It was a live-fire exercise. The enemy was listening, probing, doubting, believing in increments. One night, as a soft, pre-dawn rain tapped against the blacked-out windows, Christensen stood in the central hall. From the radio room, he heard the steady click of Eleanor's transmitter, sending the morning status reports of 1,000 fictional men. From the library, he heard Finch's low voice, coaching an actor on the proper way to sound convincingly constipated over the radio. From the workshop, he heard the ethereal repeating whisper of Choi's Echo Box, sending a ghost signal out into the rolling English hills. It was a symphony, a dark, intricate, and beautiful symphony of lies, and he knew, with a cold certainty, that the audience on the other side of the channel was now leaning in, ears straining, trying to decipher the melody. The curtain was up. The performance had begun. And the only way out was to make the ghost so real, so terrifyingly tangible, that it would eclipse the coming storm of real blood and real steel. The frozen forests of the Ardennes swallowed sound. It was a world of muffled silences, of snow-laden branches that bowed under the weight of the sky, and a cold so profound it felt like a physical presence. The pristine quiet was a lie. Beneath it, the ground trembled with the movement of panzer divisions. The German offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had torn a bloody bulge in the Allied front. At Briarwood, the abstract war of signals became violently real. The order from Turner arrived not as a typed message, but as a frantic, encrypted voice call crackling with static. The Phantom's careful, long-term construction was over. The ghost was needed on the battlefield now. Within hours, Christensen and his team were torn from their manner of whispers and loaded onto military transports. Their equipment, Choi's delicate machines of deception, was crated and handled like explosives. The journey was a plunge into chaos. The roads were choked with refugees moving west and grim-faced reinforcements moving east. The air, once filled with the sterile hum of their electronics, now tasted of diesel, snow, and a distant, acrid hint of cordite. Their new base was not a manor, but a gutted Belgian farmhouse on the western edge of the bulge. The roof was half gone, open to the iron-gray sky. Wind screamed through the shattered windows. They set up amidst the rubble, their generators coughing to life, their antennas hastily strung between skeletal trees. The contrast was jarring. From architects of a grand strategic lie, they were reduced to battlefield medics, ordered to perform emergency surgery on reality itself. Their mission was desperate and specific: create the illusion of a massive American counterattack force, the fictional Ninth Corps, mobilizing from the north to slam into the vulnerable flank of the German spearhead. They had to make the enemy believe the hammer was about to fall, to force them to divert troops, to slow their advance. But the conditions were impossible. The German radio interception here was aggressive, omnipresent. Their careful patterns, built over months in the safety of England, would be dissected in minutes. They had to work faster, dirtier, and under the constant threat of discovery. Eleanor Reed's hands, usually so steady, shook as she tuned the frequencies. The airwaves were a bedlam of real panic. Calls for artillery support, broken pleas for medics, chaotic reports of Tiger tanks emerging from the mist. Into this cacophony, she had to inject her phantom's calm, authoritative voice. She began broadcasting the mobilization orders for Ninth Corps, but she did it wrong on purpose. She let the signal waver, as if broadcast from a moving vehicle. She allowed real static to bleed in, using the chaos of the battlefield as her cover. She was no longer mimicking a perfect radio operator. She was impersonating a harried signals officer in a freezing truck, trying to hold an army together by sheer will. Arthur Finch faced his greatest challenge. The mundane gossip was useless now. He needed the sound of an army enraged, pivoting to the attack. He wrote new scripts, terse, brutal, devoid of all poetry. He used the real names of towns now under threat. He had his actors scream about fuel depots being overrun, about losing Bastogne, their voices cracking with a fury that was half performed, half genuine terror. They recorded under a blanket in the frozen cellar of the farmhouse, the actors' breath visible in the cold, their performances infused with the pervasive dread that hung over the entire front. Henry Choi's technological ballet became a desperate street fight. His roamer trucks were useless on the icy, clogged roads. Instead, he jury-rigged his equipment. He used captured German field telephones and miles of scavenged wire to create a crude, distributed network of speakers and microphones, spreading them through the woods a mile from their position. At a set time, these devices would activate, broadcasting the recorded sounds of tank engines revving, of shouted orders, of tracked vehicles moving through snow, a sonic ghost army moving through the pines. It was a crude, dangerous trick. If a German patrol stumbled upon one of the speakers, the entire operation would collapse. Christensen operated on pure nerve. He coordinated with a real, besieged American headquarters miles away, a fragile link maintained by a single runner who braved sniper fire. He fed them the Phantom's fictional positions, so their own genuine calls for help would reference the non-existent reinforcements, adding another layer of credibility to the lie for any German listener. The strain was inhuman. They worked in shifts, but sleep was a memory. The cold was a torture. Their food was frozen K-rations. The distant thunder of artillery was a constant drumbeat, a reminder of the consequences of failure. Finch developed a hacking cough that echoed through the ruined house. Eleanor's eyes became sunken pits of concentration and fear. Then, on the third night, the cost became personal. Private Danny Shaw was the youngest of their radio operators, a cheerful kid from Ohio, who could imitate a southern drawl perfectly for Finch's scripts. He was sent with 2 soldiers from the real army to emplace one of Choi's speaker units deeper in the forest. The mission was simple. Get in, hide the device, get out. They never returned. A search party found them at dawn. They had walked into a German reconnaissance patrol. A brief, brutal firefight in the snow. The 2 soldiers were dead. Shaw was alive, but the speaker equipment was a shattered mess beside him. He had tried to destroy it before being captured. He had been shot in the stomach and left for dead in the freezing snow. They brought him back to the farmhouse on a makeshift stretcher. He was conscious, his face pale as the bandages they pressed against the wound. His breathing was shallow, each gasp a ragged effort. There was no medic, no evacuation possible. The roads were cut off. Christensen knelt beside him in the rubble-strewn room. The boy's eyes were wide with pain and confusion. "The box, Captain," he whispered, blood on his lips. "I stomped on it. I think I got it." "Did I get it?" "You got it, Danny," Christensen said, his voice thick. "You did good." "It was so loud," Shaw murmured, his gaze drifting to the shattered ceiling. "The guns, I couldn't hear the phantom anymore." He died 20 minutes later, as the first gray light filtered through the broken beams. They wrapped his body in a blanket and placed it in the lean-to beside the farmhouse. The first casualty of the Phantom Division. Not killed by the enemy they were deceiving, but by the real grinding war their deception was trying to influence. The atmosphere in the farmhouse changed. It solidified. Grief was a luxury. Rage was a fuel. Eleanor Reed went back to her transmitter, her movements now precise and lethal. She began broadcasting fake casualty reports for the Phantom Corps, her voice ice-cold, listing fictional names and numbers with a grim finality that mirrored the weight of the blanket-covered form outside. Finch took Shaw's death and weaponized it. He wrote a new series of messages, not from command, but from the fictional rank and file. Anger at the losses from enemy probes, demands for revenge, a hardened, bitter resolve that seeped into every performance from his actors. The Phantom was no longer just a formation. It was gaining a grudge, a personality forged in fictional blood that felt all too real. Choi, silent and furious, worked through the night. He didn't try to repair his distributed network. Instead, he modified their main transmitter. He found a way to piggyback their signal onto the frequency of a powerful American artillery unit miles away. For brief, terrifying minutes, their phantom traffic would burst through with the authority and strength of a real combat signal before fading back to its normal strength. It created a devastating illusion. The Ghost Army was being reinforced by real, heavy firepower. They did not know if it was working. They were operating blind, in a storm of steel and snow. Then, on the 5th day, the runner from headquarters arrived, half frozen, but with a wild light in his eyes. He shoved a crumpled piece of paper into Christensen's hand. It was a decrypted German intercept, rushed from Bletchley. The message was from the commander of the 5th Panzer Army to German High Command. It reported heavy and aggressive radio traffic, indicating significant enemy force grouping north of Arthur River. It recommended cautious consolidation of eastern flank and explicitly warned against overextending further west due to potential counterattack from forming enemy corps. They had done it. They had forced a battle-hardened panzer commander to hesitate, to redirect forces, to see a monster in the snowy woods. Christensen read the message aloud to his team, huddled in the freezing farmhouse. There was no cheer, no celebration. Eleanor simply nodded, her eyes red-rimmed, and turned back to her set. Finch closed his eyes for a long moment. Choi stared at the guts of his transmitter. The victory was ash in their mouths, bought with the life of a boy from Ohio. The phantom had drawn its first real blood, but it was their own. The line between the fiction they created and the reality they inhabited had not just blurred. It had been shattered by a bullet in a frozen forest. As night fell again, the artillery thunder seemed to shift, ever so slightly, to the north. The German spearhead was slowing, looking over its shoulder at the ghost they had conjured. The baptism was complete. They were no longer ghost-makers. They were soldiers in a shadow war, and they had learned its first terrible rule. Every phantom cast a real and very long shadow. The Ardennes had been a forge, tempering them in blood and ice. Returning to Briarwood felt not like a homecoming, but like stepping onto a stage after surviving a real war. The manor's familiar chill was no longer atmospheric. It was metabolic, seeping into spirits permanently altered. The ghost of Private Shaw was their silent sixth member, his empty cot in the drafty dormitory. A monument that needed no plaque. Captain Liam Christensen carried the weight of Shaw's death as a commander's burden, but also as a personal failure. The photograph of the unknown soldier from Seraphim Cross Road now had a companion in his mind, the too young face of Danny Shaw, pale against the snow. The calculus Turner had spoken of was no longer abstract. It was a ledger with 2 entries in red. He drove himself and his team with a quieter, more ruthless intensity. There was no room for error, because error had a face. Their success in the Bulge had not gone unnoticed. Brigadier General Turner arrived at Briarwood not with congratulations, but with a new, expansive map of Europe and a chilling promotion. The Phantom unit was no longer a tactical tool. It was to become a strategic weapon of mass disorientation. "The enemy is paranoid now," Turner stated, his finger tracing a line from the Netherlands to the Alps. "They know we can conjure armies from the airwaves. Their intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, the signals divisions, they will be hunting for your fingerprints, so we will give them fingerprints everywhere. You are no longer a single ghost. You are a legion." The new directive was codenamed Operation Mirage. They were to create not one but multiple phantom threats, a chorus of deceptions across the entire Western Front. While the real Allied armies prepared for the final, monumental push across the Rhine, the Phantom unit would create a cacophony of false preparations elsewhere. The manor transformed into a war room of schizophrenia. Different rooms were assigned different fictional formations. The ballroom became the headquarters of the British 4th Airborne Corps, supposedly preparing for a massive paradrop into the Ruhr. The library birthed the French 1st Resistance Army, a guerrilla force of exaggerated strength, itching to rise up. The old conservatory housed the plans for U.S. 7th Armored Reactivations, a battered division from the Bulge now miraculously restored and reinforced beyond recognition. Each Phantom needed its own unique voice, its own logistical footprint, its own political subtext. Eleanor Reed's team split into cells, each mastering new accents, new procedural flaws for different Allied armies. She herself became a conductor of chaos, ensuring the radio traffic patterns didn't accidentally overlap or contradict, building separate, believable rhythms for each fiction. Arthur Finch descended into a creative madness. He was no longer building one army's soul, but three. He pored over intelligence reports on British military slang, on French partisan grievances, on the particular cynicism of a U.S. armored unit that had seen too much combat. He wrote manifestos for fictional French resistance leaders, sickbed speeches for a recuperating British general, and weary, technically detailed memos for American tank battalion commanders. His actors had to switch identities hourly, their voices becoming instruments in a deranged orchestra. The strain etched itself into Finch's face. He was living a dozen military lives, and his own was fading. Henry Choi's workshop looked like the engine room of a mad scientist's time machine. To simulate the dispersed, hidden nature of a resistance network, he built low-power node transmitters, small enough to be hidden in a suitcase, that could be activated by timer or remote signal. To mimic the concentrated might of an armored core, he devised a method of synchronizing multiple powerful transmitters to create a signal tsunami that would swamp German listening posts for precise, terrifying 5-minute windows. His greatest innovation was the Echo Labyrinth. It was a complex system of recorders and relays that could take a transmission from, say, the British room, and replay fragments of it hours later from a French sector, with slight alterations, creating a faint, confusing web of cross-references that would suggest covert coordination between the phantom forces. A conspiracy of ghosts. But the true adversary in this chapter was not the distant German command. It was the growing, gnawing sense of a specific, intelligent counterpresence. Their decrypted German intelligence summaries, now delivered daily, told a story of a hunt. The Germans had a name for the phenomenon: der Schattenmacher, the shadow maker. Their analysts were no longer just noting unusual traffic. They were piecing together patterns, identifying what they believed were the shadow maker's signatures. Christensen realized with a jolt of cold adrenaline that they were in a duel with a specific mind or minds on the other side. Every move they made was being scrutinized by a professional counterpart. To win, they had to not just deceive, but to outthink. They had to anticipate the anticipator. He initiated a dangerous new protocol, the double-blind lie. They would create a mistake so perfect it would be seen as a clumsy attempt to hide the truth. Finch wrote a series of overly enthusiastic, poorly encrypted messages about a planned French uprising in Strasbourg. The messages were designed to be easily broken. The hope was that German intelligence would discover them, deem them an obvious plant, and therefore conclude Strasbourg was not a target, thereby diverting forces from the city. They were lying, then wrapping the lie in a layer of exposed deception, betting on the enemy's arrogance and paranoia to guide them to the wrong conclusion. The psychological toll was immense. The team was drowning in their own fictions. Eleanor found herself muttering in fake French codes in her sleep. Finch began to refer to the phantom commanders by their names as if they were old friends, asking after General Harwood's rheumatism or Colonel Lefebvre's temper. Choi's machines whispered to each other in the night, a ceaseless electronic soliloquy of war. The breaking point came when a high-priority signal arrived from Turner. Allied cryptographers had pinpointed the lead German analyst on the Shadowmaker case. His name was Oberst Martin Weber, Abwehr Signals Intelligence. A meticulous, skeptical man, known for his disdain for Nazi Party interference. He was the spider at the center of the web they were weaving. and he was getting close. His latest report, decrypted by Bletchley, expressed a high probability that the multiple phantom forces were a coordinated effort originating from a single, highly specialized Allied unit. They were no longer anonymous. Weber was hunting them. Christensen called the team together. The air in the ballroom was electric with fatigue and fear. He laid it out plainly. The enemy had a face, a name. A brilliant, persistent mind was trying to unravel their world thread by thread. "We have been building mirages to confuse an army," Christensen said, his voice low and steady in the humming silence. "Now we must build a single, perfect mirage to fool one man. Oberst Weber. We must understand him. We must feed his skepticism, then use it to trap him. He will be looking for the flaw, the tell, the signature. So we will give him one, a signature he will believe is his own discovery." The plan was audacious and deeply personal. They would create a leak. They would fabricate a weak, disgruntled signals officer within their own phantom British Corps, a man prone to drinking and careless talk on insecure lines. This fictional officer would drop subtle, tantalizing hints about Briarwood's location, about their methods. The hints would be just credible enough to draw Weber in, to make him believe he had pierced the veil. But the location would be wrong. The methods described would be a decoy. They were setting a trap for the spider, using the web itself as bait. As they began constructing this meta-layer of deception, the atmosphere in Briarwood shifted once more. The fear was still there, but it was joined by a fierce, predatory focus. They were no longer just creators. They were hunters being hunted. Every transmission was now a move in a silent, cerebral chess game, played across a continent, with thousands of lives as the pieces. The phantom armies they commanded were the board. And Oberst Martin Weber, a man they had never seen, whose voice they had never heard, had become their true opponent. Outside, the English winter deepened. Inside Briarwood, the ghosts multiplied, their whispers growing more intricate, more layered, weaving a story so vast and so convincing, it was designed to ensnare not just an army, but the very mind trying to save it. The factory was now producing mirrors, and in them they hoped to trap the reflection of their enemy. The war within the war had become a hall of mirrors, and at its center stood the reflection of Oberst Martin Weber. His presence was no longer an abstract entry in an intelligence report. It was a palpable force in the corridors of Briarwood, a cold draft that seeped through the stone walls. Captain Liam Christensen had pinned Weber's grainy file photograph to the strategy board. It showed a man in his 50s, with a lean, ascetic face, eyes narrowed behind wire-rimmed glasses, devoid of Nazi fervor, but brimming with a corrosive intelligence. This was the mind they had to outwit. To fight him, they had to become him. Christensen commandeered an entire wing of the manor, dubbing it the Weber Room. Here they assembled everything Bletchley and OSS had gleaned: his academic papers on signal pattern analysis, his known operational history from the Eastern Front, psychological profiles, even intercepted personal letters to his sister in Hamburg that revealed a man obsessed with order, pattern, and deeply distrustful of the intuitive ravings of the Nazi political brass. Eleanor Reed immersed herself in Weber's analytical methodology. She stopped thinking like an Allied signals officer and began thinking like a hunter of ghosts. She studied his past successes, the deceptions he had unraveled. She noted his tells, his tendency to fixate on minor technical inconsistencies, his belief that every deception contained a hidden layer of arrogance from its creators. "He doesn't look for the lie," she concluded, her voice hollow from sleeplessness. "He looks for the moment the liar admires his own work. The flourish, the clever bit, that's a little too clever." Arthur Finch's task was the most perverse. He had to craft the personality of the fictional weak link, the disgruntled British officer they codenamed Cassandra. This was not a broad caricature of a drunkard, but a subtle tragedy. Finch built a history for him. Captain Alistair Gray, a career signals man passed over for promotion, resentful of the flash boys in special units, a widower who found solace in the bottle. Finch wrote Gray's fictional diary entries, full of technical bitterness and veiled references to the country house game and the puppet masters in Buckinghamshire. He imbued the character with just enough specific, accurate knowledge of real signals procedures to be credible, and just enough melancholic self-pity to be a plausible leaker. Henry Choi's technical genius was pushed to its absolute limit. The trap for Viber required a level of sonic verisimilitude that bordered on insanity. They couldn't just broadcast Gray's careless transmissions. They had to create the entire fragile ecosystem in which such a leak could exist. Choi engineered a secondary, weak-power transmitter network that simulated the back channel, lower security lines used for intra-unit gossip and supply queries, the military equivalent of a seedy bar where secrets are traded. He added layers of authentic interference, the hum of a poor generator, the faint cross-chatter of other real Allied units they piggybacked onto, the occasional burst of static that would force a repetition of a crucial, revealing phrase. The transmission had to feel stumbled upon, not presented. The first Cassandra transmission was a work of psychological warfare art. It went out on a Friday night, the time a lonely, bitter man might drink alone in his tent. The voice, performed by Finch's most nuanced actor, was weary, slightly slurred, complaining to a fictional friend about the futility of it all. The technical details were flawless. The self-pity was palpable. And buried within, like a pearl in sludge, was the bait. A mumbled reference to playing general in some drafty manor north of London, all for a bunch of Yanks who can't read a map. They released more over the following days, each carefully calibrated. Gray complained about the echo box nonsense keeping him awake, a tantalizing, cryptic reference to Choi's technology. He groused about the theater people writing his lines. The information was fragmentary, frustrating, but it painted a compelling and dangerously accurate silhouette of their operation. The goal was not to give Viber an address, but to give him a puzzle he would believe only he was brilliant enough to solve. The tension in Briarwood was a high-pitched wire thrumming just below the threshold of hearing. Every member of the team knew they were baiting a tiger. The decrypted German traffic became their only window into Viber's mind. And the view was terrifying. They watched in real time as he took the bait. First, Viber's reports began to note a pattern of ancillary, low-grade traffic with potential meta-commentary on Allied deception operations. His tone was skeptical, but intrigued. Then, a week later, a higher-level summary cited source Cassandra as a possible insight into Shadowmaker unit location and composition. The spider was approaching the web, but Viber was no fool. His next move was a masterstroke that sent a chill through Briarwood. Instead of diverting reconnaissance aircraft to the general north of London area, he initiated a subtle, brutal counterplay. German propaganda radio, via the notorious Axis Sally, began broadcasting a pointed message. In her smooth, mocking tones, she addressed the lonely captain in the country house, playing with his radios and his actors. She recited, with unnerving accuracy, snippets of the fictional Captain Gray's complaints, the echo box, the theater people. She ended with a venomous promise. "We hear you, Captain, and we are coming to take your curtain call." The broadcast was a calculated shock. It was Weiber's way of showing his hand, of demonstrating his omnipotence, of psychologically shattering the man he believed was leaking. For the real team at Briarwood, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated fear. Their adversary was not only listening, he was talking back. He was using their own fiction as a weapon to terrorize them. Finch physically recoiled from his speaker, as if the words were bullets. Eleanor's hands froze over her keyboard. For a horrific moment, the wall between their fiction and their reality vaporized. Christensen saw the panic in their eyes. This was the critical juncture. Weiber had escalated, expecting them to falter, to make a mistake, to run. "He's testing the ghost," Christensen said, his voice cutting through the silence. "He's poking it to see if it flinches. We cannot flinch. We must make our phantom bleed, just a little, in a way he expects." He ordered the Cassandra transmissions to cease abruptly. In the German listening posts, it would seem as if the leak had been discovered and silenced, a logical, expected reaction. Then he had Finch script a new series of urgent, encrypted traffic from the phantom British headquarters, expressing grave security concerns and ordering a total signals audit. It was the sound of a beast licking a wound, a perfectly believable response to exposure. The gamble was immense. They were validating Weiber's discovery, feeding his confidence. They were making him feel brilliant, all the while leading his brilliance to a preordained grave. The fictional drafty manor north of London was meticulously mapped onto a real abandoned RAF auxiliary airfield in Yorkshire, a place with the right physical profile, but hundreds of miles from Briarwood. They began seeding subtle electronic ghosts around that location, using Choi's remote nodes to create faint, tantalizing signal trails for German reconnaissance planes to follow. The chapter closed with Briarwood in a state of siege mentality, not from troops, but from a single man's intellect. They had stared into the eyes of their adversary through the static of a propaganda broadcast, and he had stared back. The mission was no longer about deceiving a faceless enemy. It was about winning a duel of wits with Martin Weiber. Every circuit they closed, every script they wrote, every signal they bounced into the night sky was a move in this most personal and deadly of games. They had given the spider a thread to follow. Now they had to wait, coiled in the darkness of their English manor, to see if he would take it, and if the web would hold. The success of the Weiber gambit was a poison pill. The confirmation from Bletchley was unequivocal. German reconnaissance flights were now intensely focused on the decoy site in Yorkshire. Oberst Weiber had taken the bait, his attention and resources locked onto a phantom within the phantom. At Briarwood, this should have been a moment of triumph, a validation of their intricate, nerve-shredding work. Instead, it revealed the fractures in their own foundation, cracks that had been widening under the relentless pressure of living a lie. The strain was no longer just psychological. It was existential. Arthur Finch had become a ghost of himself. He moved through the manor's halls, whispering lines to characters who did not exist, forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep. The boundary between his identity and those of the commanders he voiced had dissolved. He was found one morning in the library, not writing scripts, but drafting a heartfelt, strategically unsound letter of resignation from General Harwood to Eisenhower, pleading for the welfare of his men. When Christensen gently took the paper from him, Finch looked up with the confused, hurt eyes of a man betrayed. "Harwood deserves a voice," he murmured, his actor's cadence gone, replaced by a raw, plaintive need. "He's carrying the weight of so many ghosts." Finch was not breaking down. He was disappearing, his essence siphoned off to fuel the phantoms. Eleanor Reed reacted to the pressure by retreating into a cold, impenetrable shell of pure technique. The humanity she had once fought to inject into the signals, the mistakes, the ambient noise, was gone. Her transmissions became models of sterile, predictable efficiency. She argued with a logic that was technically flawless and emotionally dead that this was the ultimate perfection. To remove all trace of the creator, to let the ghost speak for itself, with machinic purity. Her clashes with Finch became silent, toxic standoffs in the corridors, a war between evaporated artistry and frozen precision. Henry Choi's physical collapse was sudden and dramatic. His body, pushed beyond its limits by amphetamines and obsession, finally rebelled. He was found convulsing on the floor of his workshop, surrounded by the whispering ghosts of his own machines. The medics diagnosed extreme nervous exhaustion and severe malnutrition. He was taken to a military hospital, unconscious, leaving a void of terrifying silence in the workshop. The machines sat idle, complex and incomprehensible to anyone else. The brilliant, silent heart of their operation had stopped beating, and Captain Liam Christensen stood at the center of this unraveling. He carried the weight of Shaw's death, the gnawing fear of Viber's intellect, the responsibility for the upcoming real invasion, and now the disintegration of his own team. The photograph on his desk was no longer just a reminder of cost. It was an accusation. He had demanded too much, forged a weapon so potent it was consuming its creators. He would lie awake at night, the manor's silence oppressive, listening for the faint, imagined hum of Choi's equipment, hearing only the ragged breathing of the breaking men and women in the rooms around him. Into this atmosphere of quiet crisis arrived Brigadier General Turner. He did not come to offer comfort or respite. He came with the final, irrevocable orders for Operation Phantom Fury. The real crossing of the Rhine was set. The Allied spearhead would strike at Remagen. The Phantom Unit's ultimate task was to make the German High Command believe, with every fiber of their being, that the main assault would come 50 miles to the north, at the heavily fortified Reese-Kalkar sector. The briefing was a study in cold, strategic brutality. Turner unrolled the maps on the grand table in the ballroom, the same table where they had once built their first Phantom from scratch. "This is not support. This is substitution," Turner stated, his finger tapping the map at Reese. "For the next 72 hours, the Ninth Corps must become the most real, the most urgent, the most terrifying threat on the Western Front, more real than the actual armies marshalling at Remagen. You will not hint, you will not suggest, you will scream it through every channel, in every voice, until the only logical conclusion for the enemy is to commit their reserves here. He pointed north. And nowhere else. The scale of the final deception was monstrous. They had to simulate the entire thunderous orchestra of an amphibious invasion in the mind of the enemy. The pre-assault bombardment, the engineering units moving bridging equipment, the traffic jams of armor, the air support requests, the chaotic, bloody first waves hitting the shore. All of it, a fiction. And all of it, they had to execute with a team that was broken, without their chief engineer, on the absolute brink. Christensen faced a mutiny by despair. Eleanor presented a clinical analysis showing their current manpower and technical capacity was insufficient by 40% to achieve Turner's directive. Finch simply stared into the middle distance, softly reciting casualty figures for a fictional battalion. The machinery of deception was grinding to a halt, its gears stripped, its fuel spent. What happened next was not leadership by command, but by desperate, shared confession. Christensen did not give a rousing speech. He gathered the shattered remnants of his team in Choi's silent workshop. He did not look at them as soldiers or specialists, but as broken people. Finch is right, Christensen began, his voice stripped bare. We are carrying too many ghosts. Shaw is a ghost. The boy from Seraphim Crossroad is a ghost. Every man who might die at Remagen if we fail will become our ghost. We are haunted. We have built a house for phantoms, and now we live in it. He paused, letting the truth of their collective trauma hang in the air. But Turner is also right. The only way out of this haunted house is through the front door. We cannot dismantle it. We must make it so loud, so bright, so terrifying that it burns down around us and takes the enemy's attention with it. He walked to Choi's main console, a beast of knobs and wires. Henry built the instruments, but the music is in us. Eleanor, your perfect, sterile signals are a symptom. You are trying to escape the human cost, but the cost is the point. Let the fear in. Let the strain into the transmission. Let them hear the voice of a command pushed to its absolute limit. Finch, you haven't lost yourself to Harwood. You've finally found him. The man is breaking under the weight of sending men to die. So let him break. On the air. Let Oberst Weiber hear a general having a quiet, professional, nervous breakdown. It was a catharsis born of utter exhaustion. He was giving them permission to stop pretending to be okay, to stop pretending they were machines. He was weaponizing their breakdown. They went to work not as a polished unit, but as survivors in the ruins of their own psyches, channeling their damage into the performance of a lifetime. Eleanor, abandoning her sterile protocols, began transmitting with a frantic, urgent energy, making minor human errors under pressure, sounding like an operator on the edge of panic, because she was. Finch, tapping directly into his own unraveling, wrote the most powerful script of his life, the final, desperate, and deeply flawed orders from General Harwood to his division commanders, orders full of bravado masking a bottomless fear, references to units that were misidentified, emotional pleas disguised as tactical commands. And Christensen, in a move of shocking personal risk, took on the voice of Harwood himself for the final crucial transmissions. Using the vocal stress Finch had crafted, he went on the air, his voice a gravelly mix of defiance and despair, announcing the commencement of Operation Thunderclap, the Phantom Crossing. It was not the performance of an actor. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of a man drowning in responsibility, and it carried a terrifying veracity. They worked in a continuous, hallucinatory, 72-hour marathon. They did not sleep. They fueled themselves on caffeine and shared trauma. They became a single malfunctioning organism, pumping the vital toxic lie into the ether. The transmissions were no longer technically perfect. They were alive. They were a dying beast's roar, full of pain, rage, and terrible conviction. As the final hours counted down to the real invasion at Remagen, Briarwood Manor was no longer a headquarters. It was the epicenter of a psychic explosion. Paper littered the floors. Equipment smoked from overuse. People slumped at their stations, asleep where they sat, or stared with bloodshot eyes at the maps of a battle that would never be fought. They had poured every last ounce of their shattered selves into the phantom. They had crossed their own breaking point and kept going, using the pieces of themselves to construct the final, most convincing illusion. The ghost army was now fully animated, not by clever tricks, but by the real, broken hearts of its creators. It stood on the fictional banks of the Rhine, a howling, cohesive, and tragically human monster of pure threat. All that remained was to see if the enemy, particularly one skeptical Oberstweiber, would choose to believe the beast was real. The final, crushing symphony of lies had been broadcast. The Phantom Unit, now less a military detachment and more a collection of conscious ruins, existed in the hollow, ringing silence that followed. In the bowels of Briarwood, there was nothing left to give. The transmitters were cold, their vacuum tubes dark, like sightless eyes. The actors' voices were ragged whispers. Captain Liam Christensen felt a profound numbness, a vacuum where purpose and terror had once warred. They had launched their phantom across the Rhine in a spectacular, fictional storm of steel and fire. Now they could only wait in the dark, listening to the real war through the fragile link of a single crackling radio receiver tuned to authentic Allied command frequencies. 100 miles away, as the first gray light smudged the horizon over the actual Rhine at Remagen, the world exploded. The receiver in Briarwood's ballroom spat to life with a cacophony of raw, unfiltered war. Distant, distorted voices shouted over the roar of actual artillery barrages, 1,000 times more chaotic than their carefully orchestrated fictions. Calls for fire support, frantic reports of landing craft taking hits, the sharp, clipped affirmations of beachheads being secured. It was the sound of truth, brutal, messy, and desperately brave. For the team at Briarwood, it was a surreal, out-of-body experience. They had spent months, years, living inside a meticulously constructed simulation. Now they listened to the reality they were designed to protect, and it sounded alien, more disordered and visceral than any lie they could conceive. Eleanor Reed listened with her head bowed, her hands, once so precise over the keys, now limp in her lap. The real operators on the other end of those transmissions were making mistakes their fictional counterparts never would, their voices cracking with a fear no actor, not even Finch at his best, could fully capture. It was humbling and horrifying. The intelligence feeds, the lifeblood of their strategic game, slowed to a trickle, and then stopped. All of Bletchley's resources, all of Allied Signal's intelligence, were now focused on the real battle, scrambling to support the men on the ground at Remagen. The Phantom Unit was cast adrift, cut off from the mirror they had held up to the enemy. They were blind. They did not know if Weiber was still staring at their decoy in Yorkshire, if German command was frantically shifting panzers north to meet their ghost. or if at this final critical moment the entire intricate FA aid had crumbled, leaving the real crossing exposed. The waiting was an exquisite new torture. It stripped away the last pretense of control. Christensen paced the perimeter of the manor, a caged animal. He saw Finch sitting motionless in a chair, staring at a wall, all the characters finally silent inside him. He saw Eleanor methodically, pointlessly, cleaning her already spotless headset. The glorious, monstrous fiction they had birthed was now out in the world, fighting its own war, and they were merely its abandoned parents. Then, a break in the static. A single, prioritized signal, relayed through a secondary channel from Turner's headquarters. It was not a report on Remagen. It was a raw, fragmentary intercept, a precious sliver of the enemy's mind captured in the chaos. A German corps commander in the Rhine sector, the exact location of their phantom assault, was screaming over an encrypted line for reinforcements. His report was frantic, unequivocal. He reported heavy enemy bombardment, multiple crossing attempts, and overwhelming infantry and armor concentrations. He was describing in perfect, terrified detail the invasion that existed only in the Phantom unit's broadcasts. He was fighting their ghost. A ragged, breathless sound escaped the team, not a cheer, but a collective release of air from lungs that had forgotten to breathe. The ghost had taken the stage. The enemy was firing artillery at empty riverbanks, committing reserves to defend against phantoms. But the true prize, the ultimate validation of their personal war, came an hour later. Another intercept, this one flagged with the highest priority. It was from Oberst Martin Weber himself, sent to the German High Command. The decryption was imperfect, riddled with gaps, but its essence was devastatingly clear. Weber's message was a masterpiece of professional despair. He stated, with cold, analytical certainty, that the primary Allied thrust was indeed occurring in the Rhine-Kalkar sector. He cited the overwhelming volume and tactical coherence of the radio traffic, the clear psychological profile of an experienced command under extreme pressure, and the confirmed movement of enemy logistical elements, all their fictions, all their carefully seeded lies. Then came the crucial, beautiful sentence, the one that vindicated every broken nerve, every moral compromise, every sleepless night. Recommendation to disregard preliminary reports of enemy activity at Remagen as diversionary tactical feints of minimal strength. He had done it. He had seen the truth, the real, vulnerable, unfolding truth at Remagen, and he had labeled it a feint. Their phantom was so real, so commanding, it had blinded the one man who was trained to see through it. Christensen read the sentence aloud, his voice flat, hollow with the shock of total victory. The room remained silent. There were no high fives, no tears of joy. This was not a sports win. This was the successful detonation of a psychological atom bomb. They had not just fooled the enemy, they had hijacked his reality. The final act was not theirs. It belonged to the real men at Remagen. The radio traffic from the real battle began to change in tone. The desperate defensive cries gradually shifted, interspersed with new, aggressive reports. Bridgehead expanding. Enemy resistance disorganized. Armor moving across the bridge. The German defense was faltering, uncoordinated, its reserves absent, its command confused, looking the wrong way. The sounds of a historic, war-changing victory began to filter through the speaker, built on a foundation of their monumental lie. Each report of an advancing American tank, each call of an objective secured, was a direct consequence of their phantom's scream. They had hollowed out the enemy's will, and real men were now charging into that emptiness. As dusk fell on Briarwood, the first comprehensive summary arrived. The Remagen bridgehead was secure, expanding rapidly against light and confused opposition. Several key German panzer divisions, the ones meant to, such a crossing, were still entangled in the north, responding to phantom threats that had already begun to fade from the airwaves, leaving only bewildered silence in their wake. Christensen looked at his team, illuminated in the soft glow of the single radio dial. They were ghosts themselves now, hollowed out, used up. They had won the ultimate game of deception. They had outthought, outfought, and outsuffered their brilliant adversary. They had saved, potentially, tens of thousands of lives. But the faces around him showed no glory, no pride. Only a bone-deep exhaustion, and the haunting, silent knowledge of the power they now held. They had proven it was possible to reach into a man's mind, even a brilliant one like Weber's, and rewrite the world. It was a victory so complete, it felt like a curse. The silence in the manor was no longer one of anticipation, but of aftermath. They had given birth to the ultimate weapon, and now they had to live in the world they had proven could be so perfectly, so terribly, deceived. Victory at Briarwood tasted of dust and lithium from spent vacuum tubes. There was no ceremony, no medal pinned to Captain Liam Christensen's chest in the grand ballroom. Instead, there was a void, a profound and unsettling quiet that settled into the manor's stones, more absolute than any they had manufactured. The machinery of deception was being dismantled. Henry Choi's beautiful, terrifying machines were powered down for the last time, their hum replaced by the hollow clang of metal crates. The walls papered with Arthur Finch's intricate personality charts and battle timelines were stripped bare, revealing faded wallpaper and the ghostly outlines of a lost, genteel past. The team existed in a state of emotional, suspended animation. The frantic purpose that had sustained them, the ever-present enemy in Oberst Weber, the looming specter of the real invasion, all of it was gone. What remained were human beings who had been forged into a single, potent weapon, now abruptly decommissioned. Eleanor Reed would sit for hours at her silent console, fingers tracing the cold keys without pressing them, as if trying to feel the echo of a transmission that had saved a world she would never see. Arthur Finch had stopped speaking in other voices, but his own was a thin, distant thing, as if he had returned from a long journey to a country no one else could remember. He spent his days in the empty library, staring at the shelves where his fictional armies had once lived. Christensen performed the bureaucratic rituals of conclusion. He wrote the final after-action report for Operation Phantom Fury, a dry, clinical document that catalogued transmission schedules and signal strengths, utterly incapable of capturing the human cost, the breaking points, the sound of a young radio man dying in the snow. He submitted the paperwork, recommending the Phantom Unit for formal dissolution. His recommendation was a foregone conclusion. Their kind of war was over. The blunt, overwhelming truth of Allied armies now marched east, and there was no need for ghosts to clear their path. Brigadier General Turner arrived for the last time. He did not speak of glory. He stood with Christensen in the now empty ballroom, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "It will be studied," Turner said, his voice low, almost conversational. "What you built here, the methodology, the psychology. This won't end with the Germans. The next war, the war after that, they will all have their phantom units. You've written the first chapter, in a new manual, a manual on how to wage war inside the enemy's mind. It was not praise. It was a verdict. Christensen understood. They had not just won a battle. They had pioneered a new, infinitely replicable form of conflict. Their legacy would not be the lives saved at Remagen, but the tool they had perfected. The ghost they had created would be immortalized in textbooks, its techniques refined, stripped of the human frailty that had, ironically, made it so convincing. They had proven a concept, and in doing so had damned future soldiers to a more perfect, more insidious form of deception. The final blow was personal. A sealed courier packet arrived for Christensen. Inside was not an order, but a transfer. He was being reassigned to a planning desk at the Pentagon. His unique, hard-won expertise was to be institutionalized, his memories and moral bruises filed away to inform theoretical scenarios. The order was a kindness and an erasure. He was to be taken out of the field, out of the realm of consequences, and turned into an analyst, a ghost of his former self, studying the hauntings he had helped invent. The night before departure, Christensen walked through the corpse of Briarwood one last time. He stood in the workshop, where oily stains on the concrete floor were the only testament to Choi's genius. He stood in the radio room, where the ghost of Shaw's laughter seemed to linger. He ended in his office. He took down the photograph of the unknown soldier from Seraphim Crossroad. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully inside his folio. He left the photograph of Oberst Weiber on the barren desk. Let the next tenants wonder. He found his team in the main hall, their bags packed, waiting for the trucks that would scatter them to the winds. No one knew what to say. The bonds forged in shared trauma were intense but unsuited for peacetime. They were not friends. They were survivors of the same psychic shipwreck. Eleanor approached him. She held out her hand, not for a handshake, but to place a single heavy vacuum tube in his palm, the final component from her primary transmitter. A souvenir with no sentimental value, only symbolic weight. "So it doesn't end up in the wrong hands," she said, her eyes clear and weary. Then she turned and boarded her truck without looking back. Finch simply nodded, a faint, sad echo of his once theatrical self. He carried with him a single, leather-bound notebook, filled not with scripts, but with what Christensen suspected were the real, private thoughts of General Harwood, the ghost's most faithful biographer, taking his creation with him into obscurity. The trucks rumbled to life, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. One by one they pulled away, carrying the architects of the century's greatest lie back into a world that would never know their names. Christensen watched until the last taillight vanished into the fog-shrouded lane. He was the last to leave. He locked the great doors of Briarwood Manor, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding home, final and absolute. He walked down the gravel drive, the manor receding behind him, a silent, blind monument to a war fought in whispers. Epilogue 1974. The Pentagon Basement Archive was a kingdom of dust and forgotten secrets. Liam Christensen, now in his late 50s, his hair steel gray, moved through the aisles with a practiced, quiet step. The crisp uniform was gone, replaced by the civilian suit of a historical consultant. He had been called in to authenticate materials for a declassification review. A young archivist, eager and bright-eyed, brought him a sealed box stamped with a faded Phantom designation. "We think this might be from one of those radio deception units, sir. Might be nothing." Christensen opened the box. Inside were not reports, but artifacts. A grease-stained schematic in Choi's unmistakable hand. A typed page of dialogue from Finch. A hilarious, mundane argument about sock rationing for a battalion that never was. And a reel of audio tape. Alone in a sterile listening room, Christensen threaded the tape onto a machine. He put on the headphones. The hiss of blank tape filled his ears. Then a voice crackled to life. It was Eleanor, young, focused, reading a fake weather report for the fictional Ninth Corps. Then another voice, Finch, performing a pompous quartermaster. Then static, and underneath it, the faint, synthesized sound of Choi's fake tank engines, a low growl from a forgotten nightmare. But at the very end of the reel, after a long stretch of silence, there was a final brief transmission. It was his own voice, exhausted, strained, speaking as General Harwood in those final desperate hours before Remagen. The voice of a man pouring his soul into a phantom. "All units, this is Harwood. Thunderclap is a go. Godspeed. See you on the other side." Christensen sat perfectly still as the tape clicked to its end. The silence that followed was not the silence of the archive. It was the silence of Briarwood. It was the silence after the last transmission. It was the silence of Shaw's last breath in the Ardennes snow. He slowly took off the headphones. The echoes of the ghosts he had made swirled in the quiet room, a testament to a victory that had saved a world and broken its saviors. He looked at the young archivist waiting outside the glass, ready to file the box away under historical curiosities. Christensen did not smile. He did not frown. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The ghost had been heard one last time. Now it could finally rest. And so, perhaps, could he? He placed the headphones down on the machine, the gentle click, the final quiet period at the end of a long, terrible, and magnificent sentence.